in May 1940 didn't just defeat the French army. They rewrote the rulebook on modern warfare. Within 6 weeks, France had fallen, and the world watched in disbelief as columns of tanks rolled past the Maginot Line, rendering it utterly irrelevant. The speed was incomprehensible. Towns that had withstood months of siege warfare in the Great War fell in hours. French infantry, equipped much as their fathers had been in 1918, found themselves facing an enemy that moved faster than their communications could track. When Panzer TIAs and IVs came rumbling down country roads supported by Stuka dive bombers and mechanized infantry, the standard response became tragically predictable: scatter, retreat, or surrender. The psychological impact exceeded the tactical devastation. German armor wasn't necessarily superior in every technical specification. French tanks often had thicker armor and comparable guns, but the coordinated Blitzkrieg doctrine created an aura of invincibility. Infantry soldiers across Europe absorbed a brutal lesson. When you hear tank tracks, you run. Anti-tank rifles, the standard issue for most armies, proved woefully inadequate against anything but the lightest German vehicles. The British Expeditionary Force, fighting alongside French units, experienced this terror firsthand. Their boys' anti-tank rifles, weighing 36 lb and firing a 55 in round, could theoretically penetrate 21 millimeters of armor at 100 yards. German Panzer, first arriving in 1940, carried 30 mm of frontal armor. The mathematics were brutally simple. At Dunkirk, between 26th of May and 4th of June 1940, the British Army executed the largest military evacuation in history. They rescued 338,226 soldiers from the beaches, but they left behind virtually all their heavy equipment, tanks, artillery pieces, vehicles, all abandoned. The anti-tank guns that might have given infantry a fighting chance against German armor sat rusting on French soil. Britain now faced the genuine possibility of invasion, and the forces defending the island possessed almost nothing capable of stopping a panzer column. The German High Command began planning Operation Sea Lion, confident that if their forces established a beachhead, British infantry would crumble before their armored spearheads, exactly as the French had done. This wasn't mere propaganda. It was based on observed reality. Throughout the French campaign, German tank commanders reported that enemy infantry typically broke and fled when armor approached. The few units that stood and fought were overwhelmed quickly. The Panzers seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to appear wherever defenders were weakest, exploit gaps, and create panic deep behind the lines. Newser footage from the period shown in cinemas across Britain reinforced the message. Tanks were the new masters of the battlefield, and infantry were obsolete relics waiting to be crushed beneath their tracks. The German tactical doctrine actively encouraged this psychological warfare. Panzer crews were trained to display aggression, to push forward even when tactical caution might suggest otherwise, because they'd learned that bold action often caused enemy formations to collapse without serious fighting. Tank commanders like Erwin RML had demonstrated in France that a relatively small armored force, aggressively employed, could paralyze and defeat a much larger conventional army. The myth of unstoppable armor became self-fulfilling. Soldiers expected to lose, so they ran, which meant they did lose. British military planners studying intelligence reports through the summer of 1940 faced an uncomfortable truth. The Wehrmacht would invade eventually. If not Britain, then somewhere. And when those panzers came rolling forward, would British infantry stand, or would they break like everyone else? The question haunted the War Office. Creating effective anti-tank weapons became an absolute priority, but this would take time, engineering resources and solutions to problems that no army had properly solved. Meanwhile, the German armored divisions were only growing stronger. The soldiers evacuated from Dunkirk brought back more than exhaustion and trauma. They brought tactical intelligence that terrified British planners. Infantry officers reported watching German tanks operate with near impunity, rushing aside defensive positions that should have held. The boys' anti-tank rifle, Britain's primary infantry anti-armor weapon, had proven itself a cruel joke. Soldiers nicknamed it the elephant gun, though not affectionately. The weapon's ferocious recoil broke collarbones and dislocated shoulders, whilst its armor-penetrating capability had already become obsolete. Firing a ton-approaching Panzer with a boy's rifle wasn't combat. It was suicide with extra steps. Britain's heavier anti-tank guns, the 2-pounder-toed pieces, were effective enough when properly positioned, but they shared a fatal flaw with all conventional anti-tank artillery. They required transportation, setup time, and predictable deployment. German reconnaissance aircraft and forward observers quickly learned to identify anti-tank gun positions, which were then neutralized by artillery or simply bypassed. What British infantry needed, what every infantry force in the world desperately needed, was something a soldier could carry, something that could be hidden in a hedgerow or a building, something that could appear from nowhere and punched through German armor before the tank crew even knew they were under attack. The problem was engineering physics. To penetrate tank armor, you needed either a very fast projectile requiring a powerful gun, which meant weight, or a very large explosive charge, requiring a substantial warhead, which also meant weight. Infantry couldn't carry conventional anti-tank guns. The weapons are simply too heavy, too visible, and too slow to reposition. Several experimental approaches had failed. Sticky bombs, explosives attached to magnetic plates, required soldiers to approach within touching distance of a tank, which proved suicidal in practice. Anti-tank grenades lacked the explosive power to reliably penetrate armor. Molotov cocktails worked occasionally against older tanks, but were hopelessly inadequate against improved German designs. Arriving in 1941, the War Office established specifications that seemed almost contradictory. They wanted a weapon light enough for 1 or 2 soldiers to carry and operate. It needed to penetrate at least 75 mm of armor, enough to threaten any German tank currently in service. The effective range should reach at least 100 yards, giving infantry some standoff distance. It had to be simple enough that conscripts could learn to use it quickly, reliable enough to function in mud, rain, and cold, and cheap enough to manufacture in the thousands. And Britain's industrial capacity was already stretched desperately thin, producing aircraft, ships, and conventional weapons. Whatever they designed couldn't require exotic materials or complex machining. Multiple design teams attacked the problem through 1940 and 1941. One approach used a spigot mortar principle where the projectile fitted over a central rod rather than being fired from inside a barrel. This allowed for a much larger warhead relative to the launcher's size. Another team investigated shaped charge warheads, which focused explosive force into a narrow jet capable of burning through armor. The Monroe effect, discovered decades earlier, but not widely exploited, offered a potential solution. A hollow cone of metal lined with explosive could penetrate armor far thicker than conventional explosives of the same weight. The physics involved converting explosive energy into a hypersonic jet of molten metal, reaching temperatures above 5,000 degrees C and pressures exceeding 300,000 per square inch. By early 1942, these experimental strands were converging into a single peculiar weapon. Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker, a somewhat eccentric ordnance officer, championed a design that used a massive coiled spring as its propulsion system. Yes, a spring like an enormous mechanical catapult. Chemical propellants were in short supply, controlled substances requiring careful handling and storage. A steel spring could be manufactured in any factory with metal working capability, required no special storage, and couldn't accidentally explode. The idea sounded absurd until you examined the mathematics. A powerful spring wound tight and release suddenly could launch a 3 lb warhead with sufficient velocity to be effective at combat ranges. Testing through 1942 showed promise, though promise is perhaps generous. Early prototypes were dangerous to their operators, temperamental, and sometimes refused to fire at all. But they did occasionally punch through armor plate in trials, and that was more than any other man-portable option could claim. The Projector, infantry, anti-tank, soon abbreviated to PIAT, emerged from its trials in late 1942, looking like no weapon anyone had seen before. At 32 pounds unloaded, it resembled a metal tube with a shoulder pad at one end and a trough on top for the bomb. The engineering was genuinely innovative, even if the operators would come to hate it. Inside that tube sat a spring weighing several pounds, compressed with such force that cocking the weapon required the operator to lie on their back, place both feet on the shoulder rest, and pull the cocking lever with their entire body weight. A soldier pulling on that lever was essentially deadlifting the weapon whilst simultaneously compressing a spring designed to generate enough force to hurl a 3 lb projectile 15 YD. The shaped charge warhead represented the weapon's true genius. The bomb itself measured 9 cm in diameter, far larger than anything a conventional rifle-caliber weapon could fire. Inside the warhead's nose cones had a copper liner shaped precisely into a cone. When the explosive detonated, the physics became almost beautiful in their violence. The blast wave collapsed the copper cone from the outside, squeezing it into a jet that moved at approximately 8,000 miles, about 25 times the speed of sound. This superheated jet could penetrate 75 mm of armor plate at a 90-degree angle. And importantly, the penetration didn't depend on the projectile's velocity. The PIAT bomb could travel relatively slowly and still punch through tank armor, which meant the spring propulsion system could actually work. But the weapon's peculiarities extended beyond its loading mechanism. Unlike conventional guns, the PIAT didn't use a trigger in the traditional sense. When fired, the spring drove a firing pin forward into a shotgun-style primer on the bomb's tail. The bomb launched forward whilst the spring and firing mechanism recoiled backward inside the tube. This recoil automatically recocked the weapon, theoretically. In practice, if the bomb failed to launch properly, or if the operator didn't hold the weapon firmly enough, the spring wouldn't compress for the next shot, and the whole agonizing cocking procedure had to be repeated. The recoil itself was legendary. Veterans described it as being kicked by a horse directly in the shoulder. Firing while standing was inadvisable, unless you enjoyed being knocked flat on your back. Production began in earnest in early 1943. British factories churned out PIATs by the thousands, whilst training courses attempted to teach soldiers how to use this peculiar weapon effectively. The training manuals read like cautionary tales. Never fire from an enclosed space. The backblast could kill you. Never lean the weapon against anything whilst loaded. It might discharge. Always ensure the bomb is fully seated in the trough. A partially loaded bomb could detonate immediately. Keep the spring mechanism clean and lightly oiled but not too oily, or it won't compress properly. In cold weather, the spring loses tension. In hot weather, the lubricants can cause malfunctions. Effective range is 100 yards, but accuracy at that distance is optimistic at best. For reliable hits, get within 50 yards. For guaranteed penetration, get closer still. The weapon's official designation caused some confusion. Calling it a projector rather than a launcher or gun was bureaucratic peculiarity. Perhaps the War Office wanted to avoid comparisons with proper anti-tank guns. Infantry, meanwhile, developed their own terminology. Some called it the PIAT bomb thrower. Others used less printable names after experiencing the shoulder-bruising recoil or wrestling with the cocking mechanism in the middle of a firefight. But unlike the boys' anti-tank rifle, which soldiers abandoned whenever possible, the PIAT earned grudging respect. It was brutish, uncomfortable, and difficult, but it worked. When a PIAT bomb hit a tank properly, the results were devastating. By mid-1943, PIATs were being distributed to infantry battalions heading for the Mediterranean theater. Each weapon came with a canvas carrier bag, several bombs, and minimal training. The shaped charge warheads were sensitive to impact and had to be handled carefully during transport. The bombs themselves looked almost comical. Bulbous heads on stick-like tails, more like oversized darts than proper ammunition. Soldiers quickly learned that the bombs could be devastating against more than just tanks. Fortified positions, concrete bunkers, and even buildings could be engaged effectively. The PIAT's versatility began to emerge in combat, though its primary purpose remained clear: give infantry a fighting chance when German armor appeared. The PIAT received its baptism of fire in Sicily during Operation Husky, the Allied invasion beginning on 10th of July. 1943, British infantry going ashore carried these unfamiliar weapons with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. The Sicily campaign presented ideal conditions for testing the PIAT's capabilities. Narrow roads, stone-walled villages, terrace hillsides where tanks were channeled into predictable routes. German and Italian armored units defending the island soon learned that British infantry no longer simply scattered when tanks approached. In one engagement near Centuripe, a PIAT team positioned in an alleyway knocked out a Panzer IV at approximately 40 yards. The shaped charge jet punched through the tank's side armor, and the crew abandoned the vehicle immediately. German after-action reports began noting something unexpected. British soldiers were actively hunting their tanks. The Italian mainland campaign that followed provided even more opportunities. The mountainous terrain of southern Italy, with its narrow valleys and winding roads, favored defenders with portable anti-tank weapons. At Salerno in September 1943, British infantry used PIATs to break up several German counterattacks that relied on armored support. The weapon's ability to be fired from buildings proved invaluable. A PIAT team on an upper floor could engage tanks from above where armor was typically thinnest, One corporal knocked out a Stoy 3 assault gun by firing directly down onto its engine deck, setting the vehicle ablaze. The German crew, expecting anti-tank guns positioned at ground level, never thought to watch the windows above them. What made the PIAT genuinely dangerous wasn't its technical specifications. It was the tactical flexibility it provided. Traditional anti-tank guns had to be positioned in advance with clear fields of fire, and once they revealed themselves by firing, enemy artillery would target them within minutes. A PIAT team could hide anywhere, wait for the perfect shot, fire once or twice, then disappear into rubble or vegetation before the enemy could respond. The weapon transformed infantry from helpless victims of armored assault into genuine threats. German tank commanders who'd spent years operating with relative impunity against infantry had to consider that every hedger, every building, every pile of rubble might conceal a soldier with a weapon capable of killing them. The PIAT-shaped charge warhead proved particularly effective against the side and rear armor of German tanks. Panzer IVs carried 30 mm of side armor, well within the PIAT's penetration capability. Even the heavier Panther tanks arriving in Italy in late 1943 had vulnerable side armor of 40 to 50 mm. A well-placed PIAT shot could disable or destroy any tank in the German inventory if it hit the right spot. The challenge, of course, was getting that shot. Engaging a tank from the front was suicidal. The thickest armor faced forward, and tank crews naturally kept their frontal arc pointed toward likely threats. Successful PIAT teams learned to position themselves where tanks would expose their flanks, at corners, in ambush positions along known routes, or in urban environments where vehicles had to turn frequently. North Africa's desert battles had already ended by the time PIATs arrived in theater, but the lessons learned there influenced PIAT tactics. Infantry anti-tank teams operated in pairs, one man to carry and fire the weapon, another to carry additional bombs and provide security. The fire needed absolute concentration to line up a shot, leaving him vulnerable to enemy infantry. The second man watched for threats and could take over if his partner was hit. Ammunition supply became critical. Each PIAT bomb weighed over 3 pounds, and a soldier could realistically carry only 3 or 4 in addition to the weapon itself. Once those were expended, the team was effectively disarmed unless they'd cached additional ammunition nearby. The psychological dynamic between tank crews and infantry began shifting through late 1943 and early 1944. German armored units had to modify their tactics. They increased infantry support, used more reconnaissance, and became far more cautious when operating in terrain that favored ambush. British infantry, conversely, discovered they could stand their ground against armor. Officers reported that men equipped with PATs showed dramatically less tendency to panic when tanks appeared. The weapon wasn't a guarantee of survival, far from it, but it provided agency. Soldiers armed with PATs weren't helpless. They were dangerous. That psychological shift mattered more than the actual kill statistics. An infantryman who believes he can fight back will behave very differently than one who believes he's already dead. The PIAT gave British soldiers that belief. When the Allies stormed ashore on 6th of June 1944, PATs went with them. The Normandy Bauge, that distinctive landscape of small fields enclosed by ancient earthen banks topped with dense hedgers, became perhaps the weapon's most famous testing ground. The terrain was claustrophobic, limiting visibility to 50 or 100 yards in many places. Roads became natural killing zones, sunken lanes with steep banks on either side where tanks couldn't maneuver off the narrow tracks. For PIAT teams, this landscape was perfect. For German tank commanders, it was a nightmare that grew worse with every passing day. The German defenders had positioned their armored reserves, expecting to counterattack and drive the invasion back into the sea. SS Panzer divisions, including the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, and Panzerlehr Division, moved toward the beachhead with confidence. These weren't the same hastily trained units that had garrisoned France. These were elite formations with combat-hardened veterans and the latest equipment. Their Panzer IV had been upgraded with additional armor. Their Panthers were arguably the finest medium tanks in the world. Their Tiger tanks were mobile fortresses. And yet, as these formations engaged British and Canadian forces pushing inland from the beaches, they discovered something unexpected. The infantry wouldn't run. Outside Caen during Operation Charwood in early July, British infantry battalions defending villages used PATs to devastating effect. German tank commanders found that advancing down a village street might result in a shape-charged bomb slamming into their flank from a bombed-out building. The Panthers' frontal armor could shrug off most Allied anti-tank rounds, but their sides remained vulnerable, and the Bocage forced tanks to expose their flanks constantly. A Panther would rumble past a hedgerow, and a PIAT team concealed in the undergrowth would fire at point-blank range. The 75mm penetration capability was more than sufficient against side armor at 30 yards. Operation Epsom, launched on 26th June, saw some of the heaviest fighting. British infantry advancing toward the Odon River faced repeated German counterattacks spearheaded by armor. The standard German tactical response, send in the Panzers to break up the attack, met unexpected resistance. Infantry companies dug into the hedgerows, engaged German tanks at ranges where pre-war doctrine said infantry should have already fled. One sergeant near Schirk knocked out 2 Panzer IVs within 10 minutes, firing from a position in a drainage ditch. The first tank was hit in the track assembly, immobilizing it. As the crew bailed out, the second tank attempted to reverse, exposing its thinner rear armor. The second PIAT bomb penetrated the engine compartment and the vehicle burned. The Germans tried adapting their tactics. They increased infantry screens around their tanks, using foot soldiers to clear suspected PIAT positions before armor moved forward. This worked to an extent, but it slowed their advance dramatically and increased infantry casualties. The Blitzkrieg doctrine that had served them so well in 1940 depended on speed and shock. When every hedge might hide an anti-tank team, speed became impossible. Tank commanders who'd been taught to push aggressively forward now found themselves edging cautiously along Norman lanes, expecting ambush at every turn. The psychological advantage had shifted. German tank crews were now the ones experiencing fear. British after-action reports from July and August 1944 document dozens of successful PIA engagements. Not every shot resulted in a kill. Shaped charge warheads were sensitive to angle of impact, and a glancing blow might fail to penetrate, but even near misses had effect. The sound of a PIAT bomb detonating against a tank's hull was distinctive and terrifying. Crews who survived one hit often abandoned their vehicles after a second, unwilling to wait for a third. The PIAT's psychological impact exceeded its actual lethality. German intelligence officers interrogating captured British soldiers specifically asked about the infantry anti-tank projector, trying to understand how many the British had and where they were deployed. By late July, as Operation Goodwood and then Operation Cobra began the breakout from Normandy, PIAT teams had become a standard element of British infantry tactics. Platoon commanders routinely positioned PIAT operators at key choke points, much as they would position machine gun teams. The weapons were no longer experimental curiosities. They were essential tools. German tactical reports from this period show a marked change in how their armored units approached infantry positions. They used more artillery preparation, more smoke, more caution. The days of Panzers rolling confidently through infantry defenses were finished. British soldiers armed with their brutal spring-loaded launchers had proven they could stand and fight. The myth of invincible armor born in France 4 years earlier was dying in the Norman hedgerows. Operating a PIAT in combat required a peculiar combination of strength, courage, and desperation. The weapon's mechanics demanded physical exertion that would be exhausting, even without people shooting at you. Consider the sequence. You've just fired your first shot, and the spring has, if you're fortunate, automatically recocked. You now need to reload. The bomb weighs just over 3 lb and must be placed carefully into the trough on top of the weapon, tail fin first, with the primer aligned precisely with where the firing pin will strike. Your hands are shaking from adrenaline. The tank you've just shot at might be disabled, or it might be traversing its turret toward your position. You have perhaps 15 seconds before that tank's machine guns or main gun turn your hiding spot into a death trap. If the weapon failed to recock automatically, a common occurrence particularly in muddy or cold conditions, the process became genuinely nightmarish. You must physically recock the spring mechanism, which means lying on your back, placing both feet on the shoulder pad, gripping the cocking handle with both hands, and pulling with your entire body strength while straightening your legs. Veterans described this as attempting to leg press roughly 200 lb, whilst under fire if you were in a confined space, a building, a trench, a hedgerow. This might be physically impossible. Some soldiers reported taking up to 90 seconds to recock a stubborn PIAT, an eternity when enemy infantry were advancing toward your position. The two-man crew arrangement evolved out of necessity rather than doctrine. One soldier, typically the stronger of the pair, served as the firer. He carried the PIAT itself and 1 or 2 bombs. His partner carried additional ammunition, usually 3 or 4 more bombs in a canvas bag, plus his own rifle and kit. The second man's role extended beyond ammunition bearer. He watched for threats whilst the firer concentrated on his target. He identified target priorities if multiple vehicles appeared. He could provide covering fire with his rifle if enemy infantry spotted their position, and critically if the firer was hit, the second man could theoretically take over, though in practice operating a patience that couldn't be instantly transferred. Effective range was officially listed as 115 yards. But this was wildly optimistic. The PIAT bomb followed a ballistic arc like a mortar round, not a flat trajectory like a gun. At 100 yards, you were essentially lobbing the bomb toward the target and hoping. Accuracy at that distance was poor enough that training manuals recommended firing only at stationary targets beyond 75 YDD. For moving targets, get closer. Most successful engagements occurred between 30 and 50 yards, close enough to ensure a hit, but not so close that the tank's machine guns would certainly kill you before you could fire. 50 yards sounds like a comfortable distance until you're watching several tons of steel and weaponry rumbling toward you at 15 miles. You have perhaps 10 seconds to aim and fire. Your shoulder already aches from the previous shot's recoil. The weapon weighs 32 lb and must be held steady despite your arms trembling. The shape charge warhead's effectiveness depended critically on impact angle. Strike the armor at 90° perpendicular, and the copper jet would penetrate with maximum efficiency. Hit at an oblique angle and the jet might glance off or fail to penetrate completely. This meant waiting for the perfect shot rather than firing as soon as the target appeared. A tank approaching head-on presented its thickest armor in the worst angle. Wait for it to pass, exposing its side. Better yet, position yourself where the tank must turn, momentarily stopping and presenting a stationary target with vulnerable side armor. This required understanding tank tactics, terrain, and timing. It required nerves that most humans don't naturally possess. The physical toll on PIAT operators was substantial. The recoil caused shoulder bruising that veterans described as resembling severe impacts. After firing 4 or 5 bombs in quick succession, your shoulder might be so badly bruised that lifting the weapon became agonizing. Some soldiers developed techniques to distribute the recoil, firing from prone positions, bracing the weapon against solid objects, but every shot still delivered a punishing blow. The cocking mechanism caused its own injuries. Soldiers reported pulled muscles, strained backs, and in some cases, hernias from repeatedly operating that vicious spring. The weapon demanded you be in peak physical condition, yet it was being operated by men who might not have eaten properly in days, who were exhausted from continuous combat, who carried 60 pounds of kit in addition to the PIAT itself. Yet for all its brutality, the PIAT worked. That's what kept soldiers using it despite the discomfort, despite the danger, despite the physical punishment. When that shape charge warhead connected properly with a Panzer's side armor, the results justified everything. The jet of superheated copper would punch through steel, and the pressure wave inside the tank would kill or maim the crew, ignite ammunition, rupture fuel tanks. A successful PIAT shot meant one less tank trying to kill you. The village of Verkij on 13th of June 1944 became one of the PIAT's most famous proving grounds, though not in the way anyone expected. The 7th Armored Division, the famed Desert Rats, had pushed forward aggressively, attempting to outflank German positions around Kong. They encountered SS Obermführer Michael Wittmann and his Tiger, one tank who proceeded to single-handedly destroy roughly 14 British tanks and numerous other vehicles in a matter of minutes. It was a disaster. But amidst the chaos, a single PIAT team managed something remarkable. Sergeant Stan Lockwood, positioned in a building along the main street, fired at Wittmann's Tiger from approximately 30 yards. The bomb struck the Tiger's side and detonated, though it failed to penetrate the heavy armor. The impact was sufficient, however, to convince Wittmann to withdraw temporarily. That PIAT shot didn't kill the Tiger, but it demonstrated that even the most fearsome German tank wasn't invulnerable to a determined infantryman with the right weapon. During Operation Epsom around the village of Gravel-sur-Ardenne on 27th of June, Corporal Edward Chapman's PIAT team achieved the sort of engagement that training manuals described, but soldiers rarely experienced. His position, concealed in a destroyed farmhouse, overlooked a junction where German counterattacks had to turn their tanks. A Panzer IV approached the corner, slowed to navigate the turn and exposed its side armor at approximately 40 yards. Chapman fired and the shape-charged jet penetrated just below the turret ring. The tank stopped immediately, smoke pouring from the hatches. As the crew bailed out, a second Panzer IV appeared following the same route. Chapman's loader had already positioned another bomb. The second shot struck the track assembly, immobilizing the vehicle. Chapman's citation for the military medal noted that he'd held his position, despite being under sustained small arms fire, waiting for the exact moment when his targets were most vulnerable. The fighting around Hill 112, that desperately contested piece of ground southwest of K, saw Pats prove their worth repeatedly. Through late June and early July, the hill changed hands multiple times with German armored counterattacks, attempting to dislodge British infantry who'd clawed their way to the crest. On 29th of June, a company of the Duke of Cornwall's light infantry faced a counterattack by Panthers from the 9th SS Panzer Division. The infantrymen dug into hastily scraped trenches, watched the Panthers approach across open ground. Standard doctrine said they should withdraw. Infantry couldn't hold against Panthers. They didn't withdraw. 3 PAT teams positioned in mutually supporting positions engaged the Panthers at ranges between 50 and 75 yards. One Panther took a direct hit on its side armor and was knocked out. The other 2 withdrew after near misses, unwilling to continue without infantry support. The company held the hill near Kong during Operation Charwood on 8th of July. Private Arthur Harnesses found himself in a situation that shouldn't have been survivable. His platoon occupying shell-damaged houses in the village outskirts came under attack by 2 Panzer IVs supporting German infantry. The first tank approached down the main street, machine guns raking the buildings. Harness, positioned on the first floor of a stone cottage, waited until the Panzer passed beneath his window. He fired almost straight down onto the tank's engine deck where armor was thinnest. The shape-charged jet penetrated and the engine caught fire immediately. The crew evacuated, running past Harness's position. The second Panzer, seeing its companion disabled, reversed rapidly and withdrew. Harness's after-action report noted that he'd been absolutely terrified throughout the engagement, but couldn't think of anything else to do except fire the weapon. These documented engagements share common elements. The PAT teams achieved success by using terrain, patience, and understanding tank vulnerabilities. They didn't engage from maximum range. They waited for targets to come closer, to expose weak points, to commit to routes they couldn't easily reverse from. They accepted extraordinary personal risk. A PAT operator firing at a tank from 40 yards was well within range of that tank's weapons. If the shot missed or if it failed to penetrate, the tank crew now knew exactly where you were. The engagement became binary. You killed the tank or the tank killed you. There wasn't much middle ground. The kill-to-loss ratio for PAT teams was never systematically recorded, but anecdotal evidence suggests it was sobering. For every successful engagement, there were teams that died attempting the same thing, caught by machine gun fire whilst trying to aim, killed by artillery after revealing their positions, crushed when tanks simply drove over their trenches. The weapon gave infantry a chance, not a guarantee, but that chance was more than they'd had in France 4 years earlier. The soldiers using PATs in Normandy weren't superhuman. They were ordinary men, often conscripts doing an extraordinarily dangerous job with an ungainly weapon. What made them remarkable was that they did it at all, that when German armor appeared, they picked up their brutal spring-loaded launchers and fought back instead of running. The PAT never achieved legendary status in the way some weapons do. It wasn't sleek or elegant. It didn't appear on propaganda posters. Soldiers didn't write home about their affection for it. Yet its impact on armored warfare psychology exceeded what its modest technical specifications might suggest. The weapon's true achievement wasn't the number of tanks it destroyed, though that number was substantial, but rather what it did to the calculus of armored operations. Before the PAT's widespread deployment, German tank commanders operated with the assumption that infantry posed minimal direct threat to their vehicles. After Normandy, that assumption died. Every building, every hedger, every pile of rubble became a potential firing position for a weapon that could kill you. The shift manifested in German tactical doctrine through 1944 and into 1945 armored. Units that had previously operated with aggressive independence now required substantial infantry support. Reconnaissance became more thorough, advances more cautious. The pace of armored operations slowed markedly when operating in terrain that favored close-range ambush. This slowdown had strategic implications. The German military's advantage had always rested partly on speed and shock. The ability to concentrate force rapidly and overwhelm defenders before they could react properly. When your tanks must inch forward, carefully checking every potential hiding spot, that advantage evaporates. The PIAT, combined with other allied anti-tank weapons, transformed armored warfare from a war of movement back towards something resembling the grinding attrition of the First World. Farsi British infantry psychology underwent an equally profound transformation. The men who'd evacuated from Dunkirk in 1940, who'd watched tanks scatter their formations, who'd learned that armor meant defeat, those lessons had to be unlearned. The PIAT provided the tool for that unlearning. When a soldier knows he possesses a weapon capable of destroying the thing that terrifies him, his behavior changes fundamentally. He doesn't panic when he hears tank tracks. He doesn't immediately consider retreat. Instead, he thinks tactically, where's my PIAT team? What's the approach route? Where are the vulnerable angles? This shift from helpless victim to potential threat changed how infantry units functioned. Commanders could position troops in locations that would have been untenable in 1940, knowing that even if enemy armor appeared, the position could be defended. The weapon's influence extended beyond the British Army. American forces observed PIAT operations in Normandy and accelerated development of their own bazooka variants. The shaped charge principle that made the PIAT effective became standard for infantry anti-tank weapons worldwide. Post-war Soviet designs incorporated lessons learned from captured PIATs. The modern rocket-propelled grenade, the anti-tank missile systems that define contemporary infantry anti-armor capability, all trace their conceptual lineage back to weapons like the PIAT, proved infantry could carry effective anti-tank weapons into combat. The PIAT remained in British service until the early 1950s, gradually replaced by more modern designs like the American bazooka, and eventually the British's Inerga anti-tank rifle grenade. By the time it was retired, the PIAT had become almost an anachronism, that peculiar spring-loaded launcher from the desperate years when Britain was improvising solutions to existential threats. Veterans who'd used the weapon in combat had mixed feelings about its retirement. Relief, certainly, that they'd never have to wrestle with that cocking mechanism again, but also a grudging respect for the ungainly thing that had given them a fighting chance when fighting chances were in short supply. The statistical record of PIAT effectiveness remains incomplete. British Army records document hundreds of successful engagements, but the chaotic nature of combat meant many actions went unrecorded. A PIAT team that knocked out a tank and was then killed by artillery fire might never appear in official tallies. Conservative estimates suggest PIATs destroyed or disabled several hundred German armored vehicles across all theaters from 1943 to 1945. More importantly, they forced thousands of tanks to withdraw, to take different routes, to operate more cautiously. The tanks that never advanced because a PIAT team might be waiting. Those don't appear in any statistics, yet they represent the weapon's truest measure of effectiveness. Perhaps the PIAT's ultimate legacy is what it represented about British military adaptation. In 1940, the Army had been humiliated, evacuated, stripped of equipment and confidence. 4 years later, that same Army was defeating the Wehrmacht in close-quarters combat, and doing it partly through sheer bloody-minded determination to develop weapons that could level the battlefield. The PIAT wasn't the best anti-tank weapon of the war. The German Panera was more effective, the American bazooka more reliable. But the PIAT was Britain's answer to a problem that had seemed unsolvable, and it worked well enough when it mattered most. The men who carried it into combat, who endured its bruising recoil and vicious cocking mechanism, who stood their ground when Panzers approached, they transformed infantry warfare. They proved that tanks weren't invincible, that infantry wasn't obsolete, that courage and a sufficiently powerful spring could change the outcome of battles. The Germans expected British infantry to run from Panzers. Instead, they pulled out PIAT launchers and fought back. That decision, repeated thousands of times across European battlefields, helped win a war.